Greetings! I'm Nathan Thompson, and this is the Escaping Samsara podcast. Here we explore the transformative paths of yoga and meditation. We have interviewed spiritual teachers, elders, and friends about their paths and hope to discover what these traditions have to offer us in the 21st century. Welcome to Escaping Samsara.
Do the intro. Hello and welcome to another episode of Escaping Samsara podcast. I'm Nathan Thompson and I'm joined here today by Leigh Brasington. Hi, Leigh.
Howdy. Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Great. So Leigh is, well, I came across Leigh's work when I was investigating Jhanas, a type of Buddhist meditation. And he's written a great book called Right Concentration, which is super clear and super, user-friendly, but without dropping any of the depth of the practice. And he's been teaching retreats and teaching on these subjects and more for a number of decades, I think. So, yeah, great to have you on, Leigh. And could you please tell us about the first spiritual experience you remember having?
Well, it's actually, I don't remember what was first. My father was a Presbyterian minister. So I grew up in a spiritual setting. It was, I would say it was more religious than spiritual. But my father was a literalist. So, I believed in Noah and the Ark, Daniel and the Lion's Den, and all the stories from the Bible. And so that was just the whole milieu of where I was. When I was, the summer after I finished high school, I read a book by James Michener called The Source, which is one of his historical novels set in Israel at a tell, an archaeological dig. And these artifacts were dug up in the 20th century. And then the story of what each artifact was and how it wound up in this site is given. And it wasn't radical theology or anything like that, but it was enough so that I could no longer suppress those evil thoughts that I had been praying God to take away, like, how did Noah get all those animals on the ark and so forth? And my whole spiritual world collapsed. In other words,
how old were you?
I was 18, and I had swallowed it all completely up to that point. The whole Bible as literal history. Of course,
could I just ask you something on that? Sorry to interrupt, but it's just interesting to me because I had a similar upbringing. My dad was a pastor of an evangelical church, and I had a similar thing happen when I was in adolescence. And for me, it was quite traumatic because I felt at the time that all the adults in my life had all lied to me, or at least misrepresented things, because it sort of became apparent to me that, like, oh, hang on. No one else in the world believes that Jesus walked on water. In fact, it's extremely unlikely he did. So how come every adult I've ever trusted has said that? And it was actually quite traumatic for me. How was it for you? Was it similar?
It was traumatic, but in a different way. It was most traumatic in that if I was wrong, I was going to hell. So I was frightened, and there was nobody I could talk to, absolutely no one. But I was going off to university, and I was going to a Presbyterian university. And they had a course at that time called Man in the Light of History and Religion that was team taught by 12 professors. And 5 of them were from the history department, 5 of them from the religion department, and 2 from philosophy. And I had signed up for that course because I knew that I could find God again. It was like I just misplaced him. He was around here someplace, and I was sure I could find him. So I just kept my mouth shut and totally freaked out. And then, of course, I found out that no, all of this stuff that I had been told wasn't true. And I didn't have quite the reaction you did. It was more like all right, if that's not so, what is true? And so it was more of trying to find out what's going on rather than being upset with the people that had been, well, they weren't lying to me because they all believed it. They were just deluded. And so it was more like I had pity for them because they had swallowed all this untrue stuff, and that was what was going on with them. And so now I had to navigate my way, go home from university and navigate my way around being back in that and going to church and, everything else, and keeping my mouth shut and, trying to figure out what was going on. And basically I developed, my spiritual discipline became ethical hedonism. Right. So
that's a confusing term.
well, I'm looking to have a good time, and I'm not going to hurt anybody along the way. So it was about, having fun, having a good time, and don't hurt anybody. And so when I was, let's see, so I was 18. When I was 29, I left on a trip around the world. Basically, I told people I was looking for adventure and education, my ethical hedonism. And what I found was education and adventure. And at that point, I encountered various spiritual traditions. I mean, I was in Southeast Asia and India, Nepal. So, yeah, you can't miss, there is a spiritual dimension of life. And so for the first time, I began, thinking about it, but not doing anything with it. And then when I was 18, I had screwed up my knees and was seeing a massage therapist who was a student of Ruth Denison's. And she said I should take up meditation, which I said yes, because that's what I told all the other people that told me I should take up meditation. By then I was living in San Francisco, and yeah, stuff like that was around. So my massage therapist said the woman who's going to be giving the retreat that's coming up is going to be giving a talk at San Francisco Zen Center. Go along. If you like her, sign up for the retreat. So I went, and it was Ayya Khema. I don't remember what her talk was about, but I remember it as being very clear. So I signed up for the retreat, and off I went on my first 10-day meditation retreat in the desert, not my car. And yeah, that was really where it all started. As an ethical hedonist, I was a pothead, smoking pot all the time. 5 nights a week, I was stoned. And when I came home from that retreat, I quit smoking. Ayya said, we are confused enough already. We don't need to ingest something that will make us even more confused. And that really struck home, because I was actually more interested in the truth than anything else. It had been that way ever since I realized, I'd been doing Easter Bunny and Santa Claus those 18 years as a Christian. And so I wanted to know what the truth was. So I was quite willing to give up the pot in order to have a clear mind so that I could meditate and start doing practice effectively.
Right. So who was Ayya Khema?
Ayya Khema was a German Jewish Theravada nun. She was born in Berlin, the daughter of a Jewish banker in 1923. So she was 10 when Hitler came to power. When she was 15, she was sent on one of the kinder transports, the children being sent overseas. It turned out to be the last one, and she was sent to Scotland. Her parents got out before the war and went to Shanghai, and she joined them by taking a Japanese freighter before Pearl Harbor to Shanghai. She lived in Shanghai, and she actually enjoyed it until the Japanese threw all Westerners in a concentration camp in 1944. She got out. She was, rescued by the Americans in 1945, but didn't get out of China till 1949. She came to America. She married. She had kids. She and her husband actually traveled from Pakistan to London in their Land Rover in the 50s, and then drove back to India, where she took up meditation. They settled on an organic farm in Australia, in Queensland. And then she encountered Buddhist meditation and found that this was what suited her, and began being serious about it, and eventually became a Theravada nun and was teaching retreats, all over the world. She had a center in Germany that she eventually settled in, but when I met her, she was running a center in Sri Lanka.
Wow. So, okay. So, but she ordained as a nun. Does that mean that her husband died, or?
He actually left her. She was teaching a retreat, and when she came home from the retreat, her son met her at the railway station with a note from her husband that said, "You're more interested in this meditation stuff than in me. I'm out of here." And he left, and she was rather upset, but she eventually had to admit he was correct. And so, they went their separate ways. He eventually settled in Nepal and was doing some sort of refugee work in Nepal. And she wound up in Sri Lanka, and that's where she was when she eventually became a nun.
Interesting. Right. So how about we take a look at dependent origination? So this is something that you have an interest in, and you're working on a book on it now. So, I've been sort of trying to get my head around it myself, and I'm still sort of like coming to terms with it and sort of trying to learn. But I don't know. I mean, how you sort of mentioned that it's one of the key things for you, or one of the most important teachings of Buddhism. So could you explain how you sort of came to that realization?
I guess I came to that realization by studying lots of what the Buddha had to say. Five skandhas, the six senses, the gradual training, Satipatthana Sutta. I mean, all of the classical stuff. And I found that the dependent origination, when I put time into trying to understand what he was teaching there, gave me more insights and deeper insights than pursuing any of these other topics. It was like the more I looked at dependent origination, the more I learned, and I never got the feeling of, okay, I got this. I understand what's being talked about. With some of the other classical topics, I would get a sense of, all right, I think I know what's going on here. But with dependent origination, it was just like I kept discovering more and more and more interesting things the deeper I got into it.
Yeah, like the thing, let's see, with the dependent origination. So do you, could you just maybe explain the two main views of that? Because there's the three life model and the here and now model, isn't there? Do you sort of subscribe to one or the other, or maybe you could just talk a little about that?
Okay, so your question obviously is that you're thinking of dependent origination as the 12 links.
Yes.
And I would say that dependent origination is a much broader topic than the 12 links. The 12 links are the example par excellence, perhaps, but they're not really the depths of dependent origination. Now, when I first started looking at dependent origination, yes, I was looking at the 12 links as well. The 12 links gets interpreted, as you say, in two broad categories. One of these is the three lifetime model, with the first two links being a previous life, and the last three links being the next life, and all the links in between being the current life. In looking through the suttas, I find exactly zero evidence that that's what the Buddha meant. And I actually find evidence that he would be appalled at the three lifetime interpretation of dependent origination. I do find one sutta, number 15 in the Long Discourses, that could definitely be a two lifetime interpretation. But I also happen to think that that sutta is probably a later composition. I could go into all the details about that, but let's just say it's one of the Kuru suttas, and I think all of the Kuru suttas the Buddha didn't speak them, that they were actually composed in the land of the Kurus and brought to the Second Council and were added in because there was some really good teaching there. But in looking at dependent origination, it's very definitely in the links something to be applied, basically, we could say, with every sensory input. So it's a moment-to-moment interpretation.
Well, I mean, I'm a bit worried we're losing people who don't know about what dependent origination is. I mean, just for me, being a bit of a newbie with it, but I find that the most interesting thing for me, because I also practice Ashtanga yoga, and I like yoga a lot. And a lot of these podcast episodes we're doing are with yoga teachers and whatnot. But for me, it really sort of like puts into perspective the difference between the Hindu model of the self and the Buddhist model of the self. Because, with dependent origination, it's that basically everything arises from causes and there's nothing outside of causes. Whereas if you look at the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, there's a kind of, I always get confused whether it's Purusha or Prakriti. I'm gonna go with Purusha, but if I'm not correct, it's Prakriti, but one of them is basically outside of causes. It's eternal, and from this eternal thing all the things arise, right? But in Buddhism, that's not the case. Everything is causes. And then you kind of think, well, okay, well, how do I get my head around the fact that there's no causes? And the best I've managed to come up with myself is just to sort of imagine it or conceptualize it as just an ocean with like no beginning or end, and that's kind of everything. That's the nearest my mind can get around it. It just There's always movement, but there's never any beginning and end.
Okay.
I don't know.
So this is good. So dependent origination in its broadest teaching is that everything arises dependent on other things. All right. So that's it. And it's more about what's going on right now than anything metaphysical. When the Buddha was asked about how did the world come to be, he said, don't go there. This will drive you nuts. It's not useful information. So dependent origination isn't an explanation of how things come to be. It's an explanation of how this that we're experiencing now has arisen. It's arisen due to past causes and conditions, as opposed to a metaphysical, there was a big bang, or, the great God of whatever did something or another. None of that is there. So it has no cosmological meaning, actually. It's just basically everything arises dependent on other things. And specifically, it's looking at, how does dukkha arise? Dukkha is probably the most important word in Pali to understand. It's usually translated as suffering, but could be better translated as unsatisfactoriness. My favorite translation is bummer, which as an old hippie, fits, because a bummer is something that bums you out, and it puts the responsibility back on you as having gotten bummed out. All right. It's your reaction to the experience you're having. And dependent origination in its heart is we have sensory contacts. Those sensory contacts generate Vedana, which is your initial categorization of a sensory input as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. And if you're not careful, you'll start craving the pleasant and craving for the absent of the unpleasant. And that will lead to clinging and then eventually dukkha. And that's the heart of dependent origination. So basically, if you don't pay attention to your sensory input, you'll get lost in running after the pleasant or running away from the unpleasant. And it's your reaction that's actually going to lead to the bummers, the unpleasant aspects of life. And dependent origination is basically giving you the key things to look for. And in particular, pay attention when you experience something pleasant, and can you enjoy it without getting lost in craving it? And when you experience something unpleasant, can you deal with the situation without getting lost in craving for its absence? That, I would say, is the essence of dependent origination.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty cool exercise actually, because if you're having a pleasant experience, often, unless I personally look carefully, there will be an element of craving in there. But then if I then look at the pleasant experience, I can then sort of differentiate the craving from the pleasant experience. And then if I can drop the craving, the pleasant experience gets even better until I
Exactly.
start craving a little bit more. And then it's okay, drop that again.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And this is what the Buddha is pointing out. Yeah. The Four Noble Truths. The first one is dukkha happens. And the second one is it arises dependent on craving. And the third one is if you don't want dukkha, don't crave. Well, easier said than done. So the fourth noble truth is, all right, here's the practices to undertake so that you can learn to stop craving.
Well, one of the things because I just did some study on the five khandhas, the five, I don't know, categorizations of a human being. Yeah. Is that fair?
That's the usual way that it's put, but actually it's five aggregates, five collections, and it's more collections of experiences that we have. We experience the world as material, or we experience it as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, or we experience it as our concepts. We experience it as our mental activity or as our consciousness. Again, avoiding the cosmological or metaphysical, the five khandhas are who we are. What you said is a very common interpretation, but I don't think that's what the Buddha actually meant at its deepest level. It's we experience the world in these five categories.
Well, what I was driving at is when it comes to impermanence and everything being related in terms of dependent origination, moment to moment, there is a bit where things get a bit funny, and it seems to be where you get to consciousness, the consciousness khandha, right? Because now maybe I'm confused, but it seems to me that when you start to look at consciousness as consciousness, there is a feeling, a kind of natural inclination to interpret that as permanent, because it's so still and empty and devoid of stuff. It's sort of like, it's almost hard to conceive of it as not being permanent. And then it seems like then the argument with Buddhism is like, okay, maybe if you're such a hardcore meditator, you get to a place where you go into some kind of cessation and consciousness disappears, and that proves that it's not permanent. Or I just read the Eckart Tolle book, A Power of Now, and he's always talking about how now, with a capital N, is always there, but you're just not aware of it. But then in the Buddhist frame, it's like, well, moment to moment, if you're not aware of the now, then the now doesn't exist, and therefore the now or consciousness is impermanent. Do you see that's a bit of a mess? Can you help me untangle it?
Okay. What I would say is if you want to see that consciousness is impermanent, take a nap. How's that? Because it goes away when you're asleep. It's just gone when you're asleep, except when you're dreaming, of course. But when you're in dreamless sleep, there's no consciousness. So where did it go? Either it's a dependently originated thing that you are generating through neurological activity, or it's gone someplace because it's not with you anymore when you're in deep dreamless sleep. So if it went somewhere, where did it go? And how does it know to come back to you? What if it comes back to the wrong person? What if it came back? It's
interesting because you sort of fill it in, don't you? You wake up and then you fill in the blank, which was I was asleep. But actually, if you don't fill in the gap, you can actually realize, actually, that's a genuine gap, isn't it?
Yeah. Or if you have surgery and they put you out, they slide you onto the table, and then the next thing you know, you're in the recovery room. And it's like, where did all those minutes or hours or how long go? Consciousness is something that is dependently originated. Just like pretty much everything else in the universe. In fact, everything is dependently originated. There's not anything that's not dependently originated, is basically what the Buddha is saying.
So it's like a way of narrowing the focus away from kind of metaphysical speculations that, to quote what you were saying about the Buddha, it's not helpful. But if you look at the moment, you can see that everything's dependently arising, including consciousness.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
the Buddha is a phenomenologist, not a metaphysician. And he's saying, what are the phenomena you're experiencing and how are you relating to them? That's the key.
You know, one of the things I think that perhaps leads to the confusion is perhaps the difficulty of understanding Tibetan teachings and other teachings on, say, emptiness, or in the Thai forest tradition, which I have an affinity for, is they talk about the deathless. You know, I mean, have you heard these terms? So, so what is referring to the deathless? Because the implication with that, and also emptiness with a capital E, is that they're kind of, I guess they're dependently originating, but the words themselves sound like they're permanent and outside dependent origination, don't they?
Yeah, it's the word emptiness is literally correct for Śūnyatā, but it's broadly misinterpreted. I'm a very big fan of Nagarjuna and his Mulamayamaka Karika, the fundamental verses on the middle way.
Sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that text. Is that a Tibetan text or?
It's a Mahayana text prior to Buddhism going to Tibet. This would be 2nd century AD. There's a book by Stephen Batchelor entitled Verses from the Center. This is what you want to work with to get to that. All right. And in chapter 24, Nagarjuna equates emptiness and dependent origination. Basically, everything is empty, everything is dependently originated. In other words, the teachings are exactly the same, only they're looking at it from slightly different directions. The emptiness is saying everything is empty of inherent existence. And the dependent origination is saying everything arises dependent on other things. And the combination is everything is empty of inherent existence because everything arises dependent on other things. Nothing stands alone. All right, so
inherent existence, by inherent existence, you mean kind of an eternal Platonic form type existence, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's still, you know, it exists, right? Perhaps it exists with a small e, but not a capital E.
It exists, but it was created. If we take a thing, people are listening to this on a device, right? So they're listening on their phone or their computer or something. It's a created thing. It has no inherent existence. It's just a bunch of silicon and plastic and metal that has been, shoved together, and it's a way that allows you to hear my voice. But the device has no inherent existence. It's not inherently a phone. You run over it with a steamroller, and you're not going to think it's a phone anymore. And before you assembled all the pieces, you didn't think it's a phone. So it's empty of phoneness, right? It doesn't have any iPhone-ness or Android-ness or anything like that in it. It's just an assemblage of other dependently originated pieces. And so that's why it's saying it's empty. And it's that way for everything, all of the things. If you look at a table, a nice wooden table, it's a table, right? Except it doesn't have tableness. It used to be trees, and then somebody cut down the trees and assembled them into this shape, and you're using it as a table. But if there's a flood that comes along, you might be using it as a life raft. Or if you desperately need firewood, you might bust it up and it becomes firewood. So the tableness was never there in the first place. That's just something we add to it with our conceptualizing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's something that if you sort of consider and meditate on, it can, well, like you said, lead to some realizations.
Yeah, this is exactly how I got there. Right. Now, your other question, the deathless. All right. So it turns out not only does the table not have tableness, or the iPhone not have iPhoneness, but I don't have me-ness. In other words, there's no essence to me either. There's nothing there that can die. And so in that sense, I'm deathless.
So are they saying the same things then? Emptiness and deathless, are they sort of synonymous?
I wouldn't say they were synonymous. I would say that the teaching on the deathless is a further downstream teaching based on an understanding of emptiness and dependent origination. In other words, you get.
Did you say how did it develop out of? If the deathless is further downstream, how did it develop, or what modifications was it making as a teaching?
It was more of a deeper realization on a personal level. In other words, the dependently originated nature of the universe is understood and seen, and then as a second step applied to oneself and realized, oh, there's no essence in me either. This is the Buddhist teaching on not self, right? No essence to be found. And if there's no essence, then there's nothing that can die. This also, to get a little clearer, requires an understanding of the self that isn't there. Right? So the Buddhist teachings on not self, what is the self that isn't there? The self that isn't there is the one that's going to be permanently happy, eventually, at least. All right? You may not be permanently happy right now, but there's some essence of you that someday is going to be permanently happy. That's the self we really want to find. That's the one that we hope gets reborn, right? This body, it's going to wear out. It's clearly not going to be here for, all that many more decades. So that's not me. And my mental stuff, that's coming and going. But somewhere inside, I want to find this essence that someday is going to be eternally happy. And what the Buddha is saying is, you can't find that. And because there's nothing like that there, there's also nothing like that there that can die. There's no essence of any sort there. And so it's then referred to as the deathless. This is not nearly as clear a leap as the leap from dependent origination to emptiness, unfortunately, though.
Well, I think you made it quite clear just now. It was helpful to me anyway. So thanks. So what was it? Yeah. So if this was contrasted with Hindu beliefs in true self, so in the true self model, it's kind of like there's a self outside of causes and conditions, and the idea is to get to that self and become one with it, and then I guess you get eternally happy. Or is that because the Buddha is contrasting his teachings with that? Was that what you meant when you were referring to something or an essence that will be eternally happy? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that was I wouldn't say it was, let's just say it was widespread during his time, but not all teachers taught that. Some were strict materialists that, when you die, your self is destroyed. And the Buddha's going, no, you don't have a self to begin with. There's nothing there to be destroyed. But the primary teaching was that, you had an essence, and that essence was going to be reborn when you died, and the quality of your rebirth was going to be dependent on how you behaved while you were here. And if you were good enough, you could have union with Brahma. And once you got union with Brahma, you're happy forever. Now, that's Brahmanism. Other teachings had other understandings, but and the Buddha's going, no, you can't find any essence here now.
Having lived in Southeast Asia for a while, it seems to me that the human mind just really struggles to live from that kind of truth because it's so radical. The human mind just really wants to oscillate between eternalism and nihilism.
Yeah.
You know, it's I mean, I've noticed it myself, and you just look at the development of Buddhism and the kind of folk practices and what have you that are basically seen to be predicated on the idea of that there is something that lives on after death. They call it the mind stream, which is, I don't know if that's a cop-out or it's just confusing. I don't know. I'm not an expert. But I guess I don't know, I'm kind of considering that my point is that like my question is it unrealistic to expect your average human to really be able to live from that kind of truth? Because it just seems like the human mind is just because me personally, sometimes I can get there, but most of the time I'm just oscillating, or most of the time I'm just in eternalism. Like if I'm honest, I just seem to, that's how I'm living my life, because I think psychologically it's very difficult to kind of let go of something like that.
Yeah, it is quite difficult. I refer to it as that everybody has their immortality project, which is to figure out, how they're going to, when the body wears out, they're not really going to die. And it took me quite a while to get to the point where I was comfortable with going, oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I just can't find any essence or any mechanism for immortality or anything like that. And it was through studying dependent origination and looking at it more and more. The sutta that probably helped me the most is in the Connected Discourses, Book 12, which is on dependent origination, Sutta 15. This is the Kaccayanagotta Sutta. Kaccayanagotta wants to know, Venerable Sir, what is right view? And the Buddha replies, Kaccayana, this world for the most part depends upon a duality, upon the notion of it is and the notion of it is not. And he goes on to say that one who has right view is looking at the world in terms of dependent origination and not falling into the extreme of existence or the extreme of non-existence. Can you become comfortable between existence and non-existence? And yeah, that's a really big step. It takes a lot of practice to get to that, but it is doable. People do get there. And yeah, it just takes a lot of training the mind to look at the world in a different way than the way we usually look at it.
So it seems like you're saying that what was instrumental in your coming to that realization was studying the suttas.
Yes.
So how did you study the suttas? I mean, were you reading them multiple times? Were you memorizing them? How did that process unfold for you?
So Ayya Khema, my teacher, was very much into the suttas. When she taught a retreat, she'd take a sutta, and she'd spend 10 days or 4 weeks going through the sutta in great detail. So that was the inspiration, basically. Just hearing her teach from the suttas enough times that I began to get enough background that things started to go click. All right. And now I had a sense of, oh, some of this stuff is starting to make sense. And I got a copy of the Long Discourses, the Wisdom Translation by Maurice Walsh, and I read it multiple times. And then Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Middle Length Discourses came out, and I read that one. And then the second time through, I started taking notes on, all right, this sutta is about this, and this sutta is about that. And then I compiled my notes, and I wound up with, some study guides for myself. I know there's a sutta where the Buddha talks about such and such. Where was that? Where did I read that? So I could look at my notes and find it and read what was there. So it was a matter of reading, making a few notes, putting the notes together in a way that helped me find things. And then when the Connected Discourses came out, it was, again, read the whole thing. And this time I was making notes right from the get-go. And I just continued to do that until I had read all of the suttas, basically. And then I sat down and read them all through again. making different notes the next time, looking specifically for the practices that the Buddha was giving to people who eventually became fully awakened. So it was the interest that my teacher had inspiring me to take an interest in them, and then reading them and studying them, and finding books from other teachers that I found helpful and so forth. Just trying to understand what they actually are saying.
And did you take some of those readings, and you were looking for the practices? Did you then sort of, I don't know, take them into your meditation and sort of experiment with something that you read and sort of go, okay, and then on the cushion you'd sort of go into that or experiment or contemplate it?
Yeah, I wrote them all up on my website, of course. I mean, pretty much everything I do, I eventually stick it on my website. And so I have a page called Enlightenment Practices, and it's got the practices in there. What's interesting is, you might have heard the Buddha gave talks and people became awakened. Well, actually, it's not that many. There are only 13 examples where someone becomes fully awakened from hearing a talk. And so in looking at it, there were talks on the 5 skandhas and talks on the 6 senses. Those were the primary topics where somebody wakes up. So it was clear that, all right, if you get a deep enough understanding of those, that could be really helpful. So those have been things that I've studied quite a lot. There's quite a variety of other topics, including, dependent origination in there. So I would say I've probably, as insight practice, investigated the Dharma from a whole lot of different perspectives.
Okay, so maybe we could move on to jhanas now, which is kind of your other area of expertise, you might say. So let's say, would you just be able to just maybe just define what they are, just for the people who don't know, and then we can sort of get into that, if that's okay, please?
Yeah. So the jhanas are 8 altered states of consciousness that are brought on by concentration, and each one yields even more concentration. This allows you, if you can get enough concentration to get to the first one, to generate more concentration, sufficient to get you to the second one, which will allow you to generate more concentration, which will enable you to get to the third one, etc. So you're stair-stepping your way down into deeper and deeper levels of concentration. The one other thing I would say, concentration is the usual translation of the Pali word samadhi, but better would be indistractibility. So these 8 states are states that you can move through one after the other, generating a mind that is more and more indistractable.
Yeah, like it's quite there's quite a bit of differing views on jhanas and their usefulness. And it seems to me to be, in terms of modern Buddhism, like one of the sort of topics where there seems to be quite a lot of disagreement, or at least different views on it. I mean, so I sort of grew up in the modern Vipassana traditions, so Goenka and then Mahasi, and Goenka has a little bit of breath meditation that may or may not lead to jhana, but a little bit of that. And then in Mahasi, it's really not really part of it, to be honest. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're just sort of, okay, you get to access concentration and use that to look at. You basically just need access concentration, and anything else, okay, fine if you've got time, but no, just access concentration. And I don't know, that has worked pretty well for me, I got to say. But what I got to after a few years of that was, I think I was just dealing with a lot of stuff coming up, which is probably quite common to a lot of people, around self-aversion or feelings of not good enough, or, these kind of things that are quite typical of people raised in the West. And I found, metta, Brahma Viharas, and jhana to really start to kind of break that apart a little bit. And so that's when I sort of got more interested in the jhanas, because I found that these kind of rocky bumps that I was hitting in my Vipassana practice were getting smoothed out. And in fact, if I then spent a bunch of time doing, Jhana or Brahma Vihara, then I didn't need to do as much Vipassana. Do you know what I mean? Because it just made the Vipassana more effective. You know what I mean? Is that a sort of common thing that you hear about?
Yeah. In fact, you can find it in the suttas, not expressed exactly the same way. So basically what the Buddha was teaching was sila, samadhi, panya, morality, concentration, wisdom. Right? So clean up your act, learn to concentrate your mind, use your concentrated mind to investigate reality and understand what's happening. So the precepts are the main sila practice, and the jhanas are the main concentration practice. And it says in the suttas, after you've been in the fourth one, you have a mind that is concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability. The given to imperturbability means that you can look at something that in the past you might have found disturbing, and you can just see it well and not be perturbed. So yes, practicing jhanas will allow you to take a look at something that in the past might have kind of freaked you out, and now you can see it for what it is. And this can be particularly helpful for the greatest failing of Western civilization, which is that people have low self-esteem. So it can be helpful for that. But it's a two-edged sword, because if you've been suppressing anything, once you start getting concentrated, any unresolved psychological issues can show up as well. So it may be that you start upping your concentration and then stuff starts showing up that you thought you had dealt with. So it sounds like in your case, you may have dealt well enough with the stuff so that when you started getting concentrated, it wasn't new stuff coming up, but an ability to look at what you had found problematic in the past and see it from a new perspective.
Well, I would agree with that, because, and you've mentioned this in other talks you've done on somatic experiencing as a good way to deal with trauma and stuff in the past. Now, I've been doing yoga as long as meditating, and I really think that working with my body in that kind of mindful yoga type way was probably a good reason for that. But when you talk about stuff showing up, as you say, like, how would that happen? Would it be I don't know, like, when stuff showing up, like what does that, how would that work, and how does that work for people?
Okay, so I'm teaching a retreat, and I want to see each of the students every 3 days or more frequently. And somebody comes in and for their interview, and they just burst into tears, and they start describing something from their childhood that has suddenly reappeared that is just, they hadn't thought about in years, and they're just really upset about the fact they got treated like that. So that's one way it could show up. It could show up with somebody coming in and just, the low self-esteem just being all of their sitting. They're just sitting there beating themselves up. They get some concentration, and then their mind wavers a bit, and they fall into, oh, I'm just terrible. I can't do this. I've never been able to do anything. And they just spin off into negative thinking. So it can show up in lots of ways like that.
Can it show up? Go on.
And if someone has been traumatized, then the traumatic situation may start replaying, in their mind, and they're right back in the middle of the traumatic situation. So
if they were working at home in daily life, could it sort of show up in just kind of weird behaviors that, in their life? Do you know what I mean? Like, because what you're talking about is confined to a retreat setting, but could it be perhaps maybe even more destabilizing if you were out of retreat? And I don't know, maybe you start thinking that you really need to quit your job and, become like a fisherman or something, when maybe that's a good idea, but maybe it's not a good idea,
Yeah, this is quite possible. It happens, I think, more frequently on retreat, simply because you're just going at it so much more intensely. At home, you're sitting an hour a day, maybe you're doing 2 hours a day. On retreat, you're doing 6 or 8 hours a day. So and nothing else is going on. So it happens a lot more frequently on retreat. But yeah, people do find that, yeah, stuff shows up when they're at home as well, and it's got to be dealt with. And hopefully on the retreat, you have a teacher you can go to when stuff gets kind of weird, and you can get a reality check. Whereas at home, you may not have anyone around to talk to.
So, I mean, how come then there's a lot of, famous teachers, respected teachers who say you just need access concentration to do your insight practices,
Well, the correct answer is you should ask them that. Because when I read the suttas, it's really clear that the Buddha felt the jhanas were a really important part of the path. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are absolutely essential, but I would go so far as to say they're really important. There's the gradual training, which is found in, I think it's 30-something different suttas, at least parts of it. And it's got.
Is that part of the elephant sutta? Is that part of? Is that one of the gradual trainings? The elephant in the forest sutta, where they? No. Yeah. Sorry, I think I must have missed that one.
The most famous sutta is the Śūnyatā Sutta, which is the second one in the long discourses, the fruits of the spiritual life. And basically, it's Sila Samadhi Panya. Clean up your act, learn to concentrate your mind, investigate reality. And so basically what the Buddha is teaching is a method of sort of getting yourself stabilized. This is the ethics. And then taking your stabilized mind and just sharpening it so much that your investigation of reality will be that much more profound. And that's what the jhanas are about. And you find the jhanas all over the place. So they appear in over half the long discourses. They appear in a third of the middle length discourses. They show up in the numerical and the connected discourses. So clearly it was an important part of his teachings. And in fact, the word meditate is the word jhana. When you would go meditate, you would go do jhana. This is pretty clear from the teaching. So it was a real integral part of spiritual discipline at that time. And so if you're a person who has some skill at concentration, here in the 21st century, it's obviously useful to use that skill on the spiritual path, and the jhanas are the way to use that skill. Now, jhanas don't necessarily work for everyone. There are, thankfully, other paths that don't require jhanas. But I would say the important thing is to recognize that if you have a skillful concentration, there is a method for using that skillful concentration, which will give you a mind that's, well, clearer, sharper, brighter, more malleable, more wieldy, and more given to imperturbability, which will make your insight practice go a lot faster.
Yeah, I understand that. And, it's the one of the issues I come across is that it seems to be you just get different messages about what the jhanas are,
Yes.
And I'm sure you're probably been addressing this for a long time now, but it is a bit of an issue because it seems like basically ordained people class the jhanas as one thing, and lay teachers will class it as another. I recently spoke to Ajahn Achalo, who is a great monk, and he's on another episode of this podcast, and I was describing my jhana practice, and I'll get to a place where it was happening irregularly, and then it becomes more regular, where it's hard to describe, but it'll be the most amazing bliss and rapture, and everything disappears into bliss, and it lasts for, I don't know, a minute or two, but it seems a lot longer, and then it sort of fades. And he said, oh, well, that's access, that's neighborhood samadhi, which I think is what we're terming access concentration. But I think with your system from your book, that would count as first jhana, even if it didn't last for too long.
Right.
So So can you explain this kind of difference, or why are we in a situation? Here's another way of thinking about it. Why are we in a situation now where we've got a bunch of ordained teachers saying jhanas are one thing and a bunch of lay teachers saying it's a different thing, or not different, or they just classify it very differently, don't they?
Yeah. So the problem is that the description of what constitutes a jhana has changed greatly in the last 2,500 years. So you can read the descriptions of the jhanas in the suttas. There's not a lot of material there, but you get a sense of what's there. And then you can read what's in the Abhidhamma. So now we're looking at, say, 200 years after the Buddha's death. And clearly the states being described there are deeper level of concentration. And then you start looking at the commentaries like the Visuddhimagga, and the states there are so deeply concentrated that they're actually quite different states. So I actually have found 38 different mental states that get the word jhana attached to them. All right, so it's not like they're the jhanas and people have different understandings. It's that there are a whole lot of different states which are different from each other that people have attached the word jhana to. And so you wind up with basically the Sutta jhanas, I would say Sutta rather than lay, and what we could call the Visuddhimagga jhanas, which are much deeper states. Venerable Paok, who's a jhana master from southern Burma, teaches his understanding of the Visuddhimagga, and in the states he's describing, you're completely oblivious to what's going on around you when you're in these states.
I think that's also Ajahn Brahm's interpretation as well.
Exactly. Although he claims never to have read the Visuddhimagga, but what he describes is exactly the same as what Paok is teaching. But then you have someone like Thanissaro Bhikkhu or Ayya Khema who are teaching stuff that's much more accessible. And yeah, it's not as deeply concentrated. So for me, the question is, all right, what's useful as opposed to what's exactly what the Buddha was doing? Is it possible that someone on a 10-day meditation retreat could learn some concentration techniques that will enhance their insight practice? And the answer is yes. And that's what Ayya Khema was teaching, and that's what I'm teaching. Do I think this is exactly what the Buddha was experiencing? No. I would suspect that he and his monks were experiencing states quite a bit deeper than a layperson's going to learn on a 10-day retreat. But I don't think they were as deep as what's described in the Visuddhimagga. So we have a spectrum here, all right? And the spectrum actually, not only are there red, orange, blue, etc., it goes to where it's even invisible. You've got ultraviolet out there in the Visuddhimagga. All right. So you've got the visible light and you've got the invisible light, or the visible electromagnetic radiation and the invisible electromagnetic radiation. All right. But it's still the same spectrum. It seems to be the same thing with the jhanas. You've got the jhanas that can be learned in a 10-day retreat. You can take them deeper. If you work at them really well, you can get to states that are probably close to what the Buddha was experiencing. And then you can take them to where they're actually just very different states. And then you've got what's in the Visuddhimagga.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but how do you know that? Have you sort of gone into the hardcore Visuddhimagga states yourself and then come out and been able to make that differentiation, or what are you basing that on?
Okay, so first off is based on the readings. All right, so I had read the suttas and I had read the Visuddhimagga, and it was like, this is describing different stuff. This is not the same thing. So that was first. But I have studied with Paok several times. The first retreat was only 1 month, and I had been warned, if you want to get to his jhanas, you better count on 6 months. So I didn't have any expectations, and I didn't get to his jhanas. But I did get supremely concentrated and experience the jhanas I had known before at a much deeper level. He would not say I was experiencing jhanas, but I
So
knew
he
that.
would say that was neighborhood concentration you were in,
Right.
then, where the kind of factors are kind of oscillating and coming together, but they never really come together into a full jhana. So is that kind of what he would say?
Well, he would say, don't do that. Go back to your breath. That's what he would say. He wouldn't say it was okay. He would just say it was a waste of time. All right. I would say that, yeah, what I'm learning from Ayya, that the jhana factors do come together, but my level of indistractability isn't strong enough so that I'm completely indistractable, that there's still some wavering there. What I got to on his month-long retreat was states that were much more stable and less likely to waver, but they weren't anywhere near what he was describing. Then later I took a 4-month retreat with him, but it was at the Forest Refuge in Massachusetts, and I had 2.5 months on retreat before he showed up. So I did get my 6 months, and I spent the 2.5 months working on concentration, so I was in good shape when he got there. And I did get to his first jhana, only once though. But yeah, it was... You talk about consciousness not being there. I was still conscious of the nimitta, the circle of light that you have to get to his jhana. But that's all I was conscious of. I wasn't unconscious, but I was completely unaware of my body, completely unaware of sounds, and completely unaware of the passage of time. It was like I absorbed into the nimitta, and then it was 45 minutes later.
Well, that's what I think that's what Ajahn Achulo was referring to when he said the reason he wouldn't class what I was experiencing as a jhana is because there was still a person able to enjoy that feeling, whereas in a jhana that person's gone. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Yeah.
Right. So in the jhanas you're teaching, then there is a person, or at least an idea of someone enjoying the pleasure.
As you get deeper, the sense of observer gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, so by the time you're in, say, the 5th jhana, you're in there. It's called infinite space, and so you're in this state where you are experiencing an infinite space. And it's really only in retrospect you realize, well, there was a point of observation. You're not in there thinking, wow, I am experiencing this infinite space. You're in there going, that's a big space. Sort of like if you see a magnificent sunset, you're usually not going, I am experiencing a magnificent sunset. You're just like, wow, look at the colors. Look, you're completely focused on the experience rather than the self-referential part. So as you get deeper and deeper into the jhanas, both as the number goes up and you get more skilled at each number, then the sense of a person experiencing it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until by the 8th jhana, if you notice a self experiencing it, it'll break up. You know, it's you got to be there without noticing it. And it's only in retrospect you realize there was a point of observation.
I mean, it seems like at the end of the day, if you just take a pragmatic view, they're kind of, they both have the same function. So it doesn't really matter if what you're doing or experiencing is classed as neighborhood concentration according to some Thai monk, or like a proper jhana according to, I don't know, yourself. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's the same experience and it's useful for the same thing, which is insight, right?
Right. If I had to summarize the Buddhist teachings right now, it would be, don't get fooled by your concepts. And jhana is a concept, right? So what are you experiencing? Is this experience useful in that once you stop having that experience and then switch to investigating reality, do you get a deeper understanding of reality? If so, yeah, keep doing that. It's working. And then don't worry about the name. Don't worry about the concept.
Yeah, that reminds me of something kind of confusing that happened. Well, it's not confusing. It was just an interesting thing because I watched, you know, who is it? The San Francisco Dharma Collective put up a 5-hour video of a course you did there.
Right.
And I watched the first part of it, and you sort of laid out the way you taught, which was doing the jhanas and then switching to an insight practice, which is not something that I'd actually done. I would tend to do, I don't know, it was not what I was doing anyway. So I did metta for 50 minutes or so, and then I did a guided metta meditation that was 50 minutes, and then when that finished, I went into like a concentration for, say, I don't know, it seemed like 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. And, it wasn't my most successful, but I got to a point where there was some pleasure and some piti and what have you. And then I was like, oh, okay. Then I switched to doing an insight practice for, 20 minutes. So I figured I'd spend about 45 minutes, right? So then I look at the clock and the whole thing took 10 minutes. And it was actually shocking to me. I mean, I've been meditating a long time, but it was so shocking at how slow that I was like, no, I was doing this jhana for half an hour. And by this clock, it was 7 minutes at max. And I swear I went through so much, I don't know, experiences in that time. It was so strange.
Yeah, once you are well concentrated, your sense of time is completely inaccurate. Sometimes you're in there and you figure you were in for, 15 minutes and it turns out to be an hour. And sometimes you're in there for what surely is an hour and it turns out to be 15 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think maybe we've covered a lot of, I don't know, I suppose what I hope to cover. And is there anything, is there anywhere that people can go to find your stuff? And your website is leighbrasington.com, is that right?
Yeah, well, that'll get you there, but easier to type is leighb.com, leighb.com. And there's a link to Jhana information, including, a paper I did on various interpretations of the jhanas and a bit about what they are and my experiences with Pao-ok. And there's a lot of stuff there on the jhanas. It hopefully is a good resource for jhanas.
For sure.
And stuff.
Yeah, and I'd also recommend your book, Right Concentration, and there's that San Francisco Dharma Collective video on YouTube, which was pretty good. So yeah, lots of places for people to find what you're up to.
Yeah.
So Leigh, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Oh, I forgot the last question. The last question is, how do you see the spiritual world today? How is it kind of unfolding from your perspective?
It's interesting. There are some very, very hopeful signs, and there are some signs that are like making me slap my forehead. The mindfulness movement, the worldwide mindfulness movement, is a really good thing in some respects, and in others, it's prostituting the Dharma. People trying to figure out how they can make money as opposed to how they can help people. So I think overall the mindfulness thing is quite good because more people are starting to realize, oh yeah, well, there's things we can do to train ourselves mentally, train the non-material parts of ourselves to look to experience the world in a more helpful way. So in that sense, it's good. I was in California. I moved here in '74, so the whole New Age thing blossomed while I was here. And it was interesting to see there was a lot more interest in the spiritual dimension of life happening, and I think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion as to what's actually useful. There are charlatans out there trying to make a buck off of things. So there's a lot of good stuff, but it does require some discrimination to pick out the good stuff from the rest of the stuff that's there. I don't know how it's all going to play out. I remember having a conversation with Gil Fronsdal a number of years ago saying something about Buddhism in the West in 100 years, and he laughed and said, "You don't want to know what it's going to look like in 100 years. You probably wouldn't approve." And yeah, It's interesting. There is the spiritual dimension of life, and the spiritual practices do seem to require some sort of institution to preserve them. But unfortunately, the institution has another agenda, which is the preservation of the institution rather than the preservation of the spiritual practices. So I'm afraid that it's always going to be the case that those who really want to go deep are going to have to look carefully to find the really deep teachings.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I don't know, it does sort of bring up another issue, which is the, Buddhism in the West. And it seems to me that, because, Buddhism in the West, it's mostly America that's been most influential, I think. Because, coming from the UK, obviously there's a Buddhist community in the UK, but it's nothing like the kind of experimental kind of like engagement that's happened in the US on quite a large scale, because you had the whole California hippie thing and it all kind of fed into that. And it just from my perspective, it seems like, you've got what's happening in America, where there's been a pretty cool freeing up of technologies and practices that were quite esoteric and difficult for people to access. And the Western Buddhists have done a pretty good job of like kind of extracting those and making them accessible in ways that people can really get stuck in. But at the same time, it's kind of lost a lot of the traditional stuff that you'll see in Southeast Asia. But then on the one hand, you can say, well, the stuff in Southeast Asia, that's sort of kind of superfluous or something, or maybe it's the idea of merit and karma doesn't really translate, so it's okay to leave that. But I just know from my experience, engaging more with the traditional ceremonial aspects of Buddhism, the more devotional aspects, the remembering of the Buddha, the chanting, the giving of merit, and these kind of practices that may be dismissed as not really heading towards liberation perhaps, but I don't know, I still find them beautiful, I find them aesthetic, I find them inspiring, and faith inducing and enhancing, so that when I can then take that into my insight practice. And I feel like that's something that really has been lost in the translation to the West. I mean, you've sort of seen that kind of unfold over time. What's your perspective?
Yeah, what you describe is very much what I'm seeing and my experience. I mean, I look at the teachers that I really, really appreciate. Ayya Khema, she was a nun. I got to study with Ajahn Buddhadasa briefly. He was a monk, and he's been a big influence. His books have been really good. You want to read about dependent origination, read his book on Under the Bodhi Tree. That's the best book on dependent origination out there. And I've studied with Ajahn Amaro a number of times, Ajahn Sumedho. Stephen Batchelor was a monk, not in the Theravadan tradition, but obviously the monastic tradition has a great deal of very valuable stuff, and I really appreciate what's there. And I also find that, it doesn't fully satisfy what I'm looking for, but I love going on retreat with the monks and nuns and really try and support them when I can. And that's where the preservation is really that's where the preservation is taking place. And all the experimental stuff, some of it is working and some of it is, well, it's experimental. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I mean, at least with the traditional, one aspect of the traditional stuff that goes on around the monasteries in Southeast Asia is, I think people are developing parami, at least developing generosity, appreciation and faith and such things. And, that's something that's, I don't know, I feel like the tradition and the trappings of the tradition, like if you see them in their best light, they are helping people cultivate parami. Whereas in a kind of more secular Western setting, Yeah, you probably are cultivating parami as well in a different way, maybe. But I don't know. I just found that it's perhaps more conducive in that traditional way, because they are taking the long view, they are taking the multiple rebirths view, and it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't get to meditate this life, but I've cultivated a whole bunch of parami, and I will have another chance next life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a useful way for building an ethical culture. Our job in the West is to build the ethical culture, and based on what we've got going on here, unfortunately, I don't think that some of the things in the East that have been very helpful for developing the paramis and the sila are going to translate very well. I mean, it's just cultural differences here. So we have to find our own ways for doing that. And yeah, understanding the whole idea behind the precepts is don't cause harm. And so the first four, don't cause harm to anyone else. And the fifth one is don't cause harm to yourself. And so can you make living a life that is harmless a really priority part of your life? And that doesn't get addressed well enough in the West, I don't think, not in the same way that it does in the East. So yeah, it's interesting, and it's a problem that probably will be ongoing, but definitely needs to be addressed. If you go on a retreat, how many talks do you hear on sila? You might get one talk on sila per retreat, but mostly it's about, insight practice or concentration or Rumi poems or whatever. Don't get me wrong, I love Rumi, but
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of people are looking to address that. I mean, do you think that the kind of relationship between psychology and psychotherapy and Buddhism in the West is perhaps a Western way of perhaps bringing in the ethical dimension in a kind of perhaps a novel way that integrates more with the Western psyche?
Hopefully that's what's happening, because certainly Buddhism in the West does have this huge psychological component. Wherever Buddhism goes, it sort of jumps on whatever is working there and, fuses. I mean, Zen basically was Taoism and Buddhism coming together. The two harmonized quite well. The same thing with psychology. It harmonizes quite well with Buddhism. And so hopefully some of the ethical aspects of Buddhism can be promoted by the ethical aspects of psychology.
Mm. Yeah, well, thanks for clearing up the last question, Leigh, and thanks a lot for joining us. That was really generous of you to spend some time with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Nathan. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have very much enjoyed this. I love talking about the Dharma. The Buddha did say that, right concentration in its highest form was talking about the Dharma. So thank you for the opportunity to do that.
Thanks for listening to the Escaping Samsara podcast. You can follow us on Instagram at ESC Samsara and find us online at www.escaping-samsara.com. On our website, you can find bonus video material, articles, tips on your practice, and updates about the next episode and what we're up to. So thanks for joining us, and remember to tune in next time and like and rate us and all that good stuff. And until next time, thank you very much and goodbye.